Since the body is the bedrock on which the social order is founded, the body is always in view and on view. As such, it invites a gaze of difference, a gaze of differentiation, the most historically constant being the gender gaze. Oyeronke Oyewumi, The Invention of Women. Oyewumi's text speaks to the way queer bodies are categorized as other, with visibly queer people, trans people, masculine women, feminine women, gender nonconforming people. Their bodies stick out as different, something unacceptable. They become the other. It is through this gender gaze that queer bodies become policed by both civilians and state institutions. By the 20th century in the United States, queer communities were growing, as was the criminalization of their existence. African Americans fought and organized through the oppressive forces of the United States. Anti-racism is regarded as a prominent movement of the 20th century because of the visibility of those involved in the organizing. Their bodies are othered in a white supremacist society because they are Black, and Black women's bodies are subject to the gender gaze and othered as women in a sexist society. For those who are both subject to a racialized gaze and a gendered gaze, they then become othered to the already standing other. Building on Oyewumi's articulation of the gendered gaze, through surveillance and policing, civilian and state, a sexualized gaze is born. Lesbians, gay men, and bisexuals become put on display for their sexuality, especially if their sexuality is read through their gender expression, specifically feminine men and masculine women. The gendered gaze takes a new shape with the expansion of the trans community. For transgender individuals, the term trans encompassing gender nonconforming people, they become the most recognizable other. Black trans people, but more specifically Black trans women, exist as the other. For LGBT African Americans, they are policed for their race, their sexuality, and their gender. The violence this brings about jails and murders Black queer people, but also erases them from the history of Blackness and queerness in the United States. When their existence is ignored and erased, the contributions they make to society are ignored and erased. History at large, but especially Black history, and then Black American history, is painted over with a cisgender heterosexist filter. The existence and significance of Black queer people in the United States is not embedded into the mainstream societal consciousness, but it exists nonetheless and on a greater scale than we know. The majority of African American liberation movements is represented by cisgender heterosexual Black men. A specific few cisgender heterosexual Black women are recognized as political and social leaders in movements, but where is the prominence of those who do not fall into the cisgender heterosexual sphere? So many of our social organizers and political leaders were or are a part of the LGBT community. Research in the late 80s and 90s revealed the enormity of queer identities throughout the Harlem Renaissance. Alan Locke, writer and philosopher of the Harlem Renaissance, was a closeted gay thinker and co-wrote the foundational philosophical text, The New Negro, centered around Black people enforcing equality. His queerness remained secret and was not a part of his public politics, but he was a significant contributor to racial equality all the same. Two of the most esteemed African American writers of the 20th century and also heavily involved in the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes and Lorraine Hansberry, were both queer. Lorraine, though not publicly, was involved in the lesbian rights organization The Daughters of the Lighters and wrote in their periodicals about the issues of racism and heterosexism. Hughes' writings were also analyzed by scholars, and pieces of his work were connected to his queerness. Their sexualities were suspected when they were alive, but kept out of the public sphere, only to be revealed after their deaths. There are several more people in history whose stories reflect theirs, but there are also those who had to endure being outed in a time where queerness was punishable by law. The queerness within the Harlem Renaissance was so open, and yet it is still able to be erased through anti-queer history. If something not openly queer can be erased, imagine how much erasure occurs in spaces and times where queerness was kept secret. Bayard Rustin is one of the most recognized gay figures from the Civil Rights Movement, though not initially by his choice. Rustin was known as one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s most trusted advisors and the organizer of the March on Washington. He was openly gay in private circles, but not in his political work. He was arrested on moral charges for having sex with men, served almost 2 months in LA County Jail, and had to register as a sex offender. He was also ridiculed by fellow organizers for being gay. Later in his life, he implemented gay rights into his politics. Like Lorraine Hansberry, he was one of the relatively early leaders and thinkers to note the importance of recognizing the connection between Black rights and gay rights.
I think the problem is that some people, including some leaders, tend to see the gay movement as supplanting the anti-racist movement, which makes no sense, because in order to have a movement against homophobia, a movement that would strive for justice for gays and lesbians, there would have to be a movement for women's justice there. There would have to be a movement for racial justice there. So it seems to me that we need to see how these movements develop and overlap.
Another noted gay figure from the Civil Rights era was Aaron Henry, co-founder of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and head of the Mississippi branch of the NAACP. He too faced criminal charges on the basis of gay sex in the 60s and 70s and continued to work in Mississippi politics until his death in the late 90s. Though there is very little research on gay and lesbian leaders in the civil rights movement, there is even less on trans leaders during this time. Pauli Murray was a lawyer, activist, and author working through the civil rights era. The majority of research on Murray uses the pronoun she, as the term transgender was not around at this time. Because of the way Murray's experience reflects that of trans people today, in this video Murray will be referred to as he. Murray's struggles with gender and sexuality began before the civil rights era in the 30s and 40s. He dated women, dressed androgynous, and even looked into hormone treatments and gender confirmation surgery, which of course was not the name of the procedure at the time. Murray developed what he termed Jane Crow, detailing the oppressions that African American women face as they are subject to the gendered gaze as well as the racialized gaze. With this, Murray, like Rustin, demonstrated the need to incorporate various sources of oppression and not just blackness in the center of political practices. Murray was heavily involved in the national political sphere, working with President Kennedy and the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. In 1950, he also published States Laws on Race and Color, centered around segregation laws, which influenced the Brown versus Board case. Pauli Murray is such an important figure because he was a trans man living a very public life and had such a great impact on civil rights. There is still little to no public images or known influence of black trans men today, but Pauli is one of the first that we knew of. The late 60s and 70s represent an amalgamation of liberation movements, with the Black Power movement, the gay liberation movement, and the second wave of the women's movement. Throughout the 70s, with the rise of the Black Panther Party, more political and social ties became connected between black, gay, and women's liberation, though gender nonconformity remained on the back burner. The Panther Party and gay liberation activists both fought heavily, specifically against police brutality, as they existed in bodies that were heavily criminalized. The Black Power movement functioned as a more militant development of what was learned during the Civil Rights era. Both the gay liberation movement and the women's movement adopted organizing strategies from the Civil Rights movement and Black Panthers. A large reason why this happened is because so many people existed in all three sectors. They understood that they could not prioritize one facet of their liberation over the other.
I was born black and a woman. I am trying to become the strongest person I can become, to live the life I have been given, and to help effect change toward a livable future for this earth and for my children. As a black, lesbian, feminist, socialist, poet, mother of two, including one boy and member of an interracial couple, I usually find myself part of some group in which the majority defines me as deviant, difficult, inferior, or just plain wrong. From my membership in all of these groups, I have learned that oppression and the intolerance of difference come in all shapes and sizes and colors and sexualities, and that among those of us who share the goals of liberation and a workable future for our children, there can be no hierarchies of oppression.
Though the fact that the 70s was marked as the black, gay, and women's movements, black trans women led parts of these movements.
Darling, I want my gay rights now. I think it's about time the gay brothers and sisters got their rights, and especially the women.
Marsha P. Johnson was a trans performer, sex worker, and activist. She was a dark-skinned, non-passing trans woman. She embodied the other. She, like the majority of trans women, could not find employment, therefore could not keep housing and reap other social benefits. Her being black and trans were factors of the system that caused her to be homeless. She did not live a single-issue life. She could not and did not choose between which part of her existence she would liberate. As a black trans sex worker, Marsha was constantly homeless and subject to police violence. The capitalist carceral institution that is the United States existed with the intention of people like Marsha being at the bottom. Because of this structure, she and many of her comrades, like Sylvia Rivera, had nothing to lose and demanded liberation for themselves. And this would mean liberation for every part of their identity. For Marcia, that meant Black, trans, poor, sex work. It meant race and gender and class. Marcia is also credited in certain spaces and erased in others for starting the Stonewall riots in 1969 by throwing the first brick through the Stonewall bar window. The riots were a result of continuous police violence inflicted on the queer community, even more so for Black trans women. Soon after, she co-founded the Gay Liberation Front, which specifically mirrored the organizing of civil rights movements for African Americans and other nations, supported the Black Panther Party, and was anti-capitalist. A year later, Marcia and Sylvia Rivera formed STAR, an organization for transgender, nonconforming, and gay people in New York City, specifically for homeless queer youth. Marcia's organizing and protesting challenged every norm of American society and paved the way for persistence of the gay liberation movement, as well as anti-capitalist and anti-police efforts today. Ms. Major Griffin Gracie was also an activist during this time and was a leader in the Stonewall riots. Shortly after, she was arrested for burglary and spent 5 years in Clinton Correctional Facility, a New York State maximum security prison for men. Upon her release, she began organizing grassroots movements for trans women, many of whom were penalized in the criminal justice system or homeless. During the AIDS crisis, Gracie continued her work working with HIV/AIDS organizations while dealing with the emotional trauma of the death toll. On into the 20th century, Gracie served as the executive director of Transgender, Gender Variant, Intersex Justice Project for incarcerated trans people. She, like Marcia, used her politics to challenge the capitalist carceral state with no choice but to liberate every part of her identity. She, like Marcia, is a Black trans woman ignored and erased by mainstream liberation efforts while doing the work that sustained abolitionist efforts today. Ms. Major Griffin Gracie is one of our few trans elders alive today who survived police and civilian violence and the AIDS epidemic and continued working for liberation. Through the 80s and 90s, the major focuses within liberation movements, specifically gay liberation, were on the HIV and AIDS epidemic and police violence. The gay liberation movement, from the beginning, but especially during the AIDS crisis, was whitewashed and trans exclusionary. People like Marcia and Ms. Major were pushed to the back and silenced as the movement grew. It went from being an anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic, anti-transphobic, anti-police, and thereby anti-capitalist movement to white cis gay men calling for equality with their white cis straight male counterparts. In the same way that Black liberation was publicly dominated by cis straight Black men calling for equality with their white cis straight male counterparts, and the same for the women's movement, all calling for equality within the existing power structure rather than a new structure. These views, of course, do not represent the entirety of any movement, but it is true that views aiming for equality within the white supremacist, cis heterosexist, capitalist carceral state have dominated the mainstream views, or in other words, have the biggest reach with the majority of the US population. Why is this? Because those who are othered, who started and led movements, were pushed to the side by those with less othered qualities in them, aiming to get to those who are not othered, or in other words, the cisgender, heterosexual, affluent white male. In Where Black Feminist Thought and Trans Feminism Meet, a Conversation, trans scholars Khayyam Green and Marquise Bay discuss the notion that Black feminism is trans and undoes rather than does. Bay states, "You touch on something really important. The simultaneous urge to disrupt and change these limited and limiting categories we use to identify ourselves and to hold them close to us because it is by virtue of these categories that we exist as subjects. We are subjectivated by these categories, so to do away with them entirely would be to feel as though we have lost ourselves." Later in the conversation, Green articulates, "The fear of losing categories isn't the trap. The trap is believing that these categories have the capacity to deliver us to ourselves fully and wholly. Again, perhaps setting our eyes on the remedy is the trap." Shifting liberation movements from disrupting and doing away with the dominant power structures is rooted in Bay's assertion that changing categories and holding on to them is done out of fear of losing ourselves. Though it can become an existential discussion, losing oneself could mean being lost in society. Not being at the front with those who seem to not be lost, who are together or normal, those who are not othered. By taking a Black trans-led movement and shifting the focus to cis white gay men, the categories of the norm are being changed from straight but held onto in every other regard, therefore distancing from the other and not being lost. The reliance on proximity to cis straight white affluent male existence is a trap that functions as a remedy to deliverance to a full and whole self. LGBT liberation is more intricately bound to Black liberation today, but there are still largely unthwarted attempts to sever them. Arguably the biggest African American, or at least African American bred, liberation movement today is Black Lives Matter. It was founded by queer Black women Alicia Garza, Patricia Cullors, and Opal Tometi. The fact that these founders are others is erased from the organization's history. In the way that the Black Lives Matter movement is dominated by cis Black male death, Black trans women's death is not given the same care or seen as severe as Black cis male death because of their position as the other. According to Say Her Name, Resisting Police Brutality Against Black Women from the African American Policy Forum, Black transgender women and gender non-conforming women are also routinely subjected to transphobic verbal harassment and abuse, unlawful and degrading searches to assign gender based on anatomical features, and dangerous placement in police custody. According to the National Transgender Discrimination Survey, 38% of Black transgender people who had interactions with police reported harassment, 14% reported physical assault, and 6% reported sexual assault. Leaders of the movement in the media and recognized by society are mostly depicted as cis heterosexual Black men. This is not an accurate representation of who is doing the work, and it does not account for the other, whose life within the white supremacist, cis heterosexist, capitalist, carceral regime does not matter. Rebecca Mulholland's Historical Erasure is Violence states, as a group relegated to the lowest rung of society, dismantling the socio-political systems of capitalism, reforming the attitudes and behaviors of those who shape the criminal legal system, and creating laws that help and protect, ultimately liberates Black transgender and gender non-conforming women of color. As a result, every other oppressed group becomes liberated. Not only must these institutions listen to Black transgender women and gender non-conforming women of color, these individuals must be included in the decision-making process so that they play a critical role in their liberation. They must be present at every level of government as they help to shape what liberation, freedom, and equality looks like. The centering of Black queer people in liberation movements is essential for total liberation of intersecting oppressions and building a new social structure.